I
think it'd be more funny if you knocked it over the video and then you had to pick it up.
No, that's okay.
Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Can you see him there? Brittany, is it
It's
the screen?
Yeah,
Is
it's
it
working.
good? Yeah. Okay, so this is the review session for the chapter 11 through 16 exam, obviously, for, well, it'd be the fall 2015 semester, although this is January in 2016. I'll have the other review session videos up. I'll put a couple of old ones too, so you can watch those if you want. But you have to do the notes on this video if you're one of the people that's watching at home. So everybody here, obviously, make sure that you sign in on the sheet. If you have not signed in on the sheet yet, do so please. The test format is very similar to the last ones in that there's matching in groups of 10, and then there's also some multiple choice where you have to apply the concepts. The only difference here is that on this test it covers 6 chapters, chapters 11 through 16. So there's 60 matching in groups of 10, because there's 10 for every chapter, right? And then there's 40 multiple choice. Usually people like that because with the matching it's very clear cut. It's like, oh, there's only one right answer. Whereas with the multiple choice you got to think a little bit more. You guys kind of agree? So traditionally people do better on this test than the other ones, I think, because of that. And then also I think that some of the chapters don't go as in depth in this unit as the other ones. So for example, chapter 14 was on education, health, and medicine. Chapter 13, family and religion, whereas some of the previous chapters are on just one thing. So then they go deeper, right? So again, because of that, I think people tend to do better on this test than others. So let's start out and just kind of talk about some of the random terms or concepts that we discussed, and then after that I'll direct you to some application questions as well. Okay, what's the difference between prejudice and discrimination? Anybody?
Isn't like prejudice like just like not strongly disliking somebody, but discrimination is like the actual act of like harming them or like racial slurs?
Yep, so discrimination's an action, whereas prejudice is a belief. Prejudice is where you unfairly believe something about a group of people, generalize it to everybody, whereas discrimination is that belief then leads to some action. Now there is another belief that's not necessarily bad or unfair, and James, but it still is an oversimplified description. What's that called? A stereotype. So, yeah, the sign-in sheet's over there if you want. So, yeah, some more.
It's actually over here.
Oh, it's over there. There you go. So anyways, stereotype is something that's still a broad generalization that's not accurate for everybody in that group, but it's not necessarily bad. So for example, let's say old grandmas are kind, right? Old grandmas are kind. That'd be a stereotype, correct? Because we can find some old grandma somewhere that's really mean for whatever reason. But that's not prejudice because it's not harming them, or that belief could not potentially harm them. Does that make sense? So it's still a broad generalization, but it's a positive one, not a negative one, okay? All right, so what then, if somebody takes discrimination to the extreme, and they try to, like, as a society, systematically kill everybody in that group, what's that called?
Genocide.
Genocide. Some people say Holocaust. The Holocaust is a specific example of genocide related obviously to World War II and the Nazis. So there's a difference in those terminologies. The Holocaust is an example of genocide, but it's a unique form of genocide. Okay. How about race and ethnicity? What's the key difference?
Ethnicity is like a cultural thing, and then race is like based on like genetics. Am I right?
Yeah, race is more genetically based, correct. So it has an element of social construction to it also, but it's based on genetically transmitted traits that people consider important. Whereas ethnicity is, again, more culturally based. Good. Okay, so that kind of has to do with chapter 11. Again, chapter 11 is on race and ethnicity. Chapter 12 was on economics and politics. So in chapter 12, the focus was on macro issues, studying social institutions of the economy and the political system and how that influence society. So let's start with, what's a social institution then? Go ahead, sir.
Is it an
Yep.
institution run by the state?
Not necessarily. Some social institutions are run by the state, but not all. Remember how we talked about agents of socialization? Mass media, peers, family, and education. So, education, collectively, social institution. When we say the family is a social institution. We don't just mean like your family or my family, we mean all the families collectively and the functions that they carry out in society. So, a social institution basically is a part of society that is organized or works together to serve a specific function. So it's a social structure that exists to fulfill a specific function. We also talked about, as it relates to the economy, different sectors of the economy. So we had primary, secondary, and tertiary. Give me an example of each.
Isn't primary like working in the field?
Not just
It's
fields.
Like manual labor.
The raw materials.
Collecting materials.
Yep, it's often manual labor, but it's actually pulling materials out of the environment to make them useful for people. So you work on an oil rig, you're a farmer, you're a rancher, primary sector, okay? Then what's secondary?
Processing those things like a manufacturing plant.
Yep.
Products.
Yep, so, or you could be like a framer, you're somebody that's framing houses, right? That's still manual labor, but it's different. You're not actually chopping the trees down, right? You're taking them and you're building them into a house. Or you're in the mill, you're the person that's setting up the lumber and machines to make it useful. So that's secondary, and then what's tertiary?
Like service,
Service industries, so teacher, tertiary,
nurse,
nurse, yeah, waitress at Village Inn, right? So that'd be tertiary. Okay, let's also talk about types of, well, actually, let me ask you what the definition of this is first, and we'll talk about types of it. What is power, first of all? What's the definition for power?
The ability to get your desired end even with resistance.
Yeah, to get what you want, even with resistance, is power, okay? What is power that people consider legitimate? What's that called?
authority,
Authority. Okay, that leads us to the last one. What were the three types of authority that we talked about? No.
it was charismatic, Basil?
Charismatic's one,
Traditional,
traditional's another,
national legal.
and rational legal's the third one, okay? So let me give you an example of somebody. Now again, with people, there's often many examples of it, right? So take teachers, for example. There's laws and policies on the books that say that students have to listen to teachers to some degree, right? So that's rational legal. But there are some teachers that people just like a lot, they're friendly, they're good at their job. What would that be?
Charismatic.
Charismatic, okay? So let me give you an example of somebody and I want you to say what authority matches with them the most. Make sense? Okay, let's go, Cyrus the Great was a
Traditional.
emperor in Persia.
Legal.
Traditional mostly, I would say, yeah.
Wish I could get it
How about Obama?
Legal,
National legal.
I'd say rational legal mostly. Again, we have a constitution that says this person has this power because of the president, right? To get in that position, you have to have some charismatic authority, but once you're there, I think it's mostly rational legal. Okay, how about your parents?
Traditional.
I think it's mostly traditional, but yeah, do we have laws that say you have to listen to your parents to some degree? Yeah, like you can't run away, that's a crime if you're under a certain age. Like you guys are 18, you could go and be like, I'm out, drop the mic and then leave, right? And you wouldn't get in trouble, your life would be harder for a while, but you could do it legally. But yeah, I'd say traditional mostly. So you think you could identify those? Okay, good. All right. what is, in the text, we talked about different models for analyzing politics. That talks about how some people view politics as a whole bunch of different groups that want things. So you have like the women's rights groups, and then you have like the guns rights groups, and then you have the business interest groups, and you have all these different groups that want to have a say in stuff, right? There's one model that looks at power like that, and then there's another model that looks at power as like the rich and powerful people all work together to try to control everybody else. Do you remember what those models are called? Remember, I didn't talk about this in too much depth, but I briefly mentioned this. If you look at the name of these terms, it kind of gives you a clue in the name. So one's called the power elite model, and one's called the pluralist model of power.
The elite one would be the where the rich conspire to put the bottom down more.
Correct.
Like
Yep.
conflict theory.
Yep, and that relates to conflict theory. That was my next question. Good.
And the pluralist would be the other one.
Pluralist would be where you have a whole bunch of different groups that do stuff. Exactly. Okay, what is a system of government that's ruled by a small group of people?
Oligarchy?
Oligarchy, yep. So if you apply that to economics, let's say you have like 3 big companies that control everything. If it's one big company that controls everything, what's that called?
Monopoly.
Monopoly. If it's like 2 or 3, that's called a oligopoly. So like an oligarchy, it's the same root word there, but it's applied to business. Okay? I think that's pretty straightforward. Okay, let's talk about some stuff as it relates to religion then. Family and religion is chapter 13. One of the trends that you're seeing as it relates to religion is this polarization worldwide, even within like the United States or other societies where there's a lot of people, you don't have a lot of people in the middle that are kind of like, oh, religion is okay, I'm gonna kind of sort of be involved in religion. It's either people are getting more religious, more fundamentalist, or they're getting less. You're seeing that worldwide. There's not a lot of people in the middle. So fundamentalists are people that believe that their holy text is literal, that they, like their religious beliefs are completely true, all that stuff. So on the opposite side, what's it called when religious views and institutions lose their influence? Secularization, they become more secularized, exactly. So let's say we had a panel speaking on an issue, like Obama gave a big speech about guns today and proposed some executive action. Let's say they had a panel and there were 5 people speaking on that panel, and one guy had like a doctorate in theology and he was a pastor at a real big church. And some other person was a psychologist, studied like mental illness, because that's something they talk about with gun violence a lot, right? And then somebody else owned like a big business, and there was a politician. A lot of people are gonna look at that panel and be like, oh, the pastor has a biased slant because of his religious beliefs, right? A lot of people would view that now. Rightly or wrongly, I think that's, average person would think that right now. So that, the influence that people have had because of religion in the past in the United States, I think is kind of going away to some degree. That process is called secularization. Okay. As it relates to family then, what does the text define as the family? What does the text define the family as? Talked about this a little bit before. It has a purpose, it's a social group, so what is it?
It's a social institution.
It's a social institution.
It's like kids that are the raising of children.
Yep.
Care for one another.
Yep, it's a social institution that binds together, unites people together to care for one another, and then to oversee the raising of children. Exactly. Okay? So how do we trace family then?
Ancestry.
Yeah, descent. So it's the way we trace by kinship, right? And kinship is relationship, often based on blood, right? by a bloodline. Okay, a specific example of religious belief that's common in native systems, native societies, so whether it's in Latin America, or whether it's like Native Americans, so indigenous people, they believe in systems where the animals and nature is inhabited by spirits. What's that called? What's the general term for a religious system that believes that nature and animals, trees, and all that is inhabited by spirits? Yeah, that term's a little bit. That's called animism in general. You guys remember that, hearing of that before, animism? Okay, if you marry somebody and that person has similar social characteristics as you, what's that called? This is where understanding root words really helps. This will help you in college too later, where you might be taking a test, you're like, I have no idea what this word means. But if you look at the word, you can break it down into parts, it helps you, right? What if you're married to one person, what's that called? Monogamy, right? What if you're married to many people? Polygamy. So what's the root word there, basically? Well, that's the prefix, right? It's the end part, the gammy or whatever, okay? So you can tell that that part has something to do with marriage, right? So if you're marrying people or somebody that has similar social characteristics as you, what's that called?
It's intra something.
No,
No? Inter?
no. It's a good, intra means within, but it's homogamy. Homogamy means the same, right? So in that instance, the prefix homo, like homosexual, right, attractions to members of the same sex. Homogamy means marrying people with the same social characteristics as you. Okay, so what is it if you marry somebody that's different then? That's outside of the social characteristics. Exogamy, yep. So again, that's a thing where just knowing how to break words down into parts like that is really helpful in so many different classes.
What was the word?
Exogamy, yeah, X-O-G-A-M-Y. Okay, so the other stuff I think is pretty straightforward. Chapter 14 has to do with education, healthcare, and medicine. This is kind of a debated issue quite a bit that relates to the pro-life camp, but it's not abortion. The other thing they debate on is how do you handle people that are like really terminally ill with cancer? The doctor's like, you're gonna die in 3 months. Should they be allowed to take their own life at that point in time? What's that topic called?
Are you talking about like mercy killing?
Yeah, sort of. It's called euthanasia. You guys remember hearing of that before? Euthanasia. We didn't really discuss that too much because we ended up discussing abortion quite a bit, but that used to be more of a hot button issue, but it's not as much anymore. Okay, so you guys know what an eating disorder is. I don't even have to explain that one, right? What do you think? Good to go? Okay, what's the,
Wait, so what's euthanasia?
it's, so somebody has really bad cancer or something, the doctor's like, you're gonna die in 6 months, and they're like 80 years old. Some people argue that at that point, they should be able to commit suicide to avoid the period of suffering. And that basically allowing them to commit suicide, or some people actually want it so they could like go to the doctor, and then the doctor would inject them with stuff and then they die. So basically assisting somebody that has a terminal illness to commit suicide is called
Is
euthanasia.
that the same thing where like if somebody's hooked up to machines like they're alive, but they're not gonna like come out of their coma?
Not really, no. In that instance, that's,
That's one versus.
yeah. Euthanasia involves somebody that, under normal circumstances, would continue to live for a time, but they're suffering or they're going to suffer, and they wanna avoid that, so they wanna choose to die. You see the difference? That's different than somebody that's hooked up to a machine and the doctor's like, there's no brainwave activity, you know, they're gonna die. It's like, without this machine, they'd die. That's different than euthanasia. Most people would kind of draw that distinction. But, okay, in education, when you put the, like elite students in a group, and then kind of the middle students in a group, and another students in a group, what's that called?
Tracking.
Tracking, yep. So what are some of the pros and cons of that? Do you remember? Go ahead.
It challenges the smarter kids, it makes them smarter, but I think it like keeps the kids who are smart at the same level.
Yeah.
level.
So the arguments in favor of it is it allows instruction to better meet the needs of people at that time. But the con is that those differences continue. If you put all the people that struggle together in a class and you slow the pace down for them, then they're always gonna be behind, right? Okay, so what is it called, the formal instruction under trained teachers? What's that called?
Schooling.
Schooling, yep. So what's the social institution then that deals with socialization, preparing the workforce, education? You see the difference? What's the general term for a measure of physical, mental, and social well-being of somebody?
Health.
Health, yep. What's the social institution that focuses on improving health and fighting disease then?
Medicine.
Medicine, yep. So in medicine, one of the things they try to do is they try to study health and how diseases spread, smoking rates, a bunch of things like that, right? The youth risk behavior survey we do in class kind of relates to that. The one where it tells you like how many students smoke, how many eat 3 meals a day at least, how many eat vegetables. They're trying to measure diseases in part there, right? So what's that process specifically called? What's the study of tracking diseases? That's a very specific term as it relates to medicine. But then if you relate it to sociology, it's epidemiology is the study of the spread of diseases. So social epidemiology is what that term would be. So it's interesting, like, we talk about this in psychology a little bit, but for a time in the last decade, what demographic group had the largest rise in STDs as a percentage? Anybody guess?
Like what race?
No, what age?
Um,
Like,
Teenagers.
no,
30-year-olds.
no,
40, 50-year-olds?
like 70-year-olds. Like what was it? Yeah, so the population's aging, right? There's a lot of people retiring, moving into homes, maybe spouse passed away or whatever. So then, yeah, they had a big problem with STDs in retirement homes. There was a story on like CNN about that. So social epidemiology tries to study that. Yeah, it's interesting. What's it called if you can read and write, but you can't read or write well enough to hold a job that well, or
Functional literacy.
functional illiteracy? Good. Because you can't function, right? Functional and you're illiterate. You're not totally illiterate, like you might know your name or be able to write basically, but you're functionally illiterate, you can't function in society that way. Okay, that leads us to chapter 15. Chapter 15 was on demography, so it's basically population changes. This is something you're seeing worldwide also, the tendency of people to move from smaller cities to bigger cities. What's that called? Urbanization. So you see that again, big countries like the United States, smaller countries, rural areas like North Dakota, larger states like California, that's a trend that you're seeing quite a bit. So what is like an area of a city, take Fargo, it's not like downtown Fargo or it's not close to downtown, but like West Fargo would be viewed as this of Fargo basically. A suburb, yep. So that's another trend you're seeing quite a bit. What's the movement of people from one place to another called? Migration, yep. So if you go into a country, it's called
Immigration.
immigration, yep. Studying the effect that urbanization has on the like environment in an area, what's that called? Ecology, yep. Urban ecology specifically. Okay, two of the more abstract terms we talked about in that chapter were Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. Do you remember the mental trick that I told you that I used to remember this?
Does it combine like kinship and like family, but the other one is like personal interest?
Yeah, so Gemeinschaft is based on kinship, tradition, values, whereas Gesellschaft is people come together for self-interest. So the way I remember that mostly is in the middle of Gesellschaft, you have Sell, right? So they're coming together to do business, basically. They don't necessarily care about each other, maybe they do, but it's more about the, hey, I wanna buy this thing, whatever. Whereas in Gemeinschaft, it's like people come together to get together. What's a measure of the number of people that die in a country called? What's that statistic? Mortality rates, and then how about number that are born? Fertility rates, yeah. Okay, that leads us to chapter 16, which we didn't really talk about too much, but we watched that video and then you had some assignments related to it. Chapter 16 again was about social change. It talked about a physical event that is super widespread and causes a bunch of extensive harm to people and property. That's a disaster and how that leads to a lot of social change. So for example, you look in North Dakota, how we had that big flood, didn't quite overtake Fargo, but it came very, very close, right? And now they're talking about spending like $1.4 billion to build this big diversion. It's fairly controversial about how they're gonna fund it, but regardless, it's some type of change, right? Disasters lead to quite a bit of change. What is an activity that encourages or maybe discourages social change called? You had this in the civil rights, they call it the civil rights movement. Have you heard that phrase before? The civil rights movement, women's rights movement, you heard it phrased that way? So it's a social movement, just any organization or group that tries to make some change, right? What's another example of that? Like in history,
Of the social movement?
yeah, in history, they say civil rights movement, right, when they're studying it, or they'll say the women's rights movement.
Like it's something like encouraging like the acceptance of like gay marriages and things. Could that be an example of that?
Yeah, that'd be a social movement too.
Okay.
Yep, yep. Okay. One of the first guys that studied this was a guy named Emil Durkheim. He's one of the early sociologists. He talked about a condition in society where there was very little moral guidance. Very little moral guidance. What's that called? Yeah.
A-N-O-I.
Anomie. Yep. A-N-O-M-I-E. So it's not necessarily like in a society, let's say Nazi Germany, right? Nazi Germany wouldn't be anomie. Do they have moral guidance? Are they telling people what to do?
Yeah.
Yeah, the morals are bad, but there is guidance there. They're like, this is what's good, this is what you should do. Anomie is more like nobody really knows what to do, it's just, there's no direction. Does that make sense? Okay. What's it called if, like in terms of poverty, if you're super, super poor and you're gonna die if somebody doesn't help you? Absolute poverty. What if you like compare yourself to somebody else and you have less? Relative poverty. So then that comparison would be called relative deprivations, kind of the same thing. I saw a lot of people use this in one of their terms for the chapter 16 discussion. It's called tradition directedness. Somebody give an example of that, like related to current events or something. Tradition directedness, excuse me. What is that, first of all? What is it? And then give an example. Tradition directedness. That's where, so I'll define it and then I'll have you give an example then. But tradition directedness is where people very strictly conform to traditional patterns of behavior, of values, of norms, of culture, or whatever. So what's an example of that then, historically or current events? You could see it in the movie we've been watching, right?
Yeah.
So the booster and the president of the college, they're opening the gym door and he's like, oh, there's 7 of them on the team. And the other guy's like, actually, there's 12. And then what is the other guy's response?
Like, of those people or something.
Referencing the African American players, right?
Yeah.
So they're exhibiting tradition directedness because that's the way the guy says, we've never had that here, we shouldn't do it. What are you trying to do, right? They're focusing on the past, okay? Sometimes tradition directedness is bad, like it was there. Sometimes it could be good from a moral standpoint. But it doesn't matter if it's focusing on what it was like in the past and how things have been done, tradition directedness, okay?
What about like the Salem witch trials? Like, could that be something when they were like, believing like they thought that they were witches or whatever, and to believe that they should like, I guess, get rid of them maybe?
Yeah, that could be tradition directedness too. Because it gets really extreme when they're like,
Yeah.
oh, you're bad, you're doing this stuff, yep. What are the social changes that resulted from industrialization called? Yeah, modernization, or just in general, it's modernity. So then after that, they had kind of a backlash to it called postmodernity. Again, those are some periods of social change. So modernity basically says science and technology and industrialization is going to solve the problems, right? We do this enough, it'll solve the problems. Well, we're pretty industrialized now. Do we have all our problems fixed? No, so there was a backlash to that postmodernity. Okay, so let's talk about some application then. Does anybody have any questions about anything through that so far? No? It's quiet here. The fan's off, everybody's just quiet. Okay. All right. Remember we had that graphic on social distance that I broke down? And it was like, I would accept somebody that was Italian or African American or Chinese as a family member, a close friend, etc. Do you remember that graphic? Okay. Which 2 groups were the furthest to the right, indicating that they experienced the most prejudice? Do you remember?
It was like in the Middle East, I think.
Yeah, Arab and Muslim were the 2. And then the text talked about, they hypothesized or they theorized about why. What did the text identify as the reason? September 11th, right? So you can actually chart that where, like right after World War II or right during World War II, Germans and Japanese took a hit on that scale, correct? Because of what was going on. So during the Cold War, what group took a hit? Russians, right? So that's research that's on something called social distance, okay? Remember also we talked about different theories of prejudice. One of those theories was scapegoat theory. What did scapegoat theory attribute prejudice to? Or what does scapegoat theory say causes prejudice?
Wasn't it like people blaming another like race or something for their problems?
Exactly. So again, Nazism applied basically. Hitler did that with the Jewish people extensively. So you see that with, South Park kind of made fun of this where they had 3 or 4 episodes and they still kind of do it where somebody would be up there and they're talking about immigrants, they go, they took our jobs, and then it gets like worse every time they say it. You remember seeing that? So scapegoat theory would say, assuming the people got their jobs taken, or at least they believed that their jobs had been taken by immigrants, that's what causes the prejudice, right? That perception. Okay, we talked about sectors of the economy again. Let's break down some elements of that though a little bit more. So, primary is mining, farming, whatever. Secondary is taking those materials like in a mill and making them used for people, some construction stuff, all that. Tertiary is service sector then. So let me give you an example, I want you to tell me which one it fits in, okay? White collar occupation. Tertiary, so that'd be like a profession where you need training. It's some type of service thing. With white collar, it's an element of tertiary that requires training and has some prestige to it. How about blue collar? What would that fit in mostly?
Secondary.
Secondary or primary, right? So if you're working in mining, you're building houses, whatever, that's a blue collar. Blue collar means work that traditionally has been done by males that involves typically physical manual labor, right? So then how about pink collar? What sector of the economy would that fit in?
Tertiary.
Tertiary. And then how does that differ from blue collar?
Women.
Okay, jobs that traditionally have been filled by women. Yep. Okay, if you move from somewhere and over time you lose your cultural heritage, you change those. Have you changed your race or ethnic background? Ethnic, because it's more culturally based, right? Okay, what's a group of people that's socially disadvantaged called? A minority. Do you have to be like way less people to be a minority in that sense? No. No. So what's the example I gave in class about that? I gave 2 examples historically. Like, let's go 1840 in Georgia somewhere, right? Some county in Georgia somewhere in 1840, there were more African American people than there were white people, right? Somewhere we could find data that says in this county there were 5,000 people and 800 of them were white and 4,200 were black, right? But the black people would still be considered minorities because what's the key variable?
Power.
Power is the key variable, right? So it's not necessarily numbers, although often there's a number relationship too, but it has to do with the amount of power, okay? All right, if you are in a country that has a mostly market-based economy with a lot of social welfare programs, what type of economy is that, or what type of country would that be?
Welfare state.
Yeah, welfare capitalism, but yeah, welfare state. So you have a decent amount of freedom, but the government still has a bunch of social programs. Okay? Let's talk about functionalism, SI, conflict theory, and exchange theory and all that, as it relates to the family, right? Functionalists would say, what would they focus on when they're analyzing the family?
That it's to raise children.
They'd,
Its function.
yep, they'd focus on the purpose of the family, what's its function. Conflict theorists would focus on what?
The family can trickle down.
Yeah, how the family can be used to keep other groups out of power. Yep. Okay, how about exchange theorists, what would they focus on?
Weighing the options of a family.
Yep.
Whether it's good or bad.
Yeah, all aspects of a family. So you're trying to determine if you should adopt or not. You to exchange theorists, they think that you subconsciously weigh the pros and cons, even if you don't actually write it down like Ted does with his lists on How I Met Your Mother all the time. But you're subconsciously doing that. You're going to college, you're like, I want to date somebody, potentially try to find a spouse. I'm in class with this girl. She's smart, cute, kind of nice, but she laughs really weird. don't know if I can handle that. This girl, not quite as nice, still pretty nice, not quite as nice, but her laugh is normal. You might decide to go with the girl without the crazy laugh, right? So exchange theorists would say you're gonna break that down kind of little by little. And then SI theorists would focus on what?
All the symbols and the things.
How symbols or even physical things might represent something, so wedding rings, whatever. So I think I told you a story about a buddy of mine when I worked out at the Y. He was a single guy, he's married now and has a couple kids, but he was trying to meet somebody that he could date so he could find a wife, you know. And he'd be polite and like talk to the other girls maybe a little bit, but if he saw somebody had a wedding ring on, he's like, I'm not really gonna talk to you. But then if he saw some other girls that he was like, oh, good morning, nice to see you, how's your day? You know, he'd like try to talk to them a little bit more. And he's a really, really nice guy, and he saw that symbol, and he knew that that represented, oh, that person is taken in a relationship. I'm not gonna talk to them as much, it's not worth my time in a way, right? So, or even like in relationships, how words or actions might mean something different from one couple to another. I think I told you, like in our relationship, I have this way that I tell my wife that I love her, where I rub her finger and then I rub the top of her hand and then I pick her hand up a little bit. It's like, I love you so much. And then like, so if I grab her hand and I do that, she knows that that means I love you so much, right? So if some other, like you're dating somebody and you did that to your girlfriend, later she'd be like, what the heck was that? You know what I mean? Do I have something on my hand, or, you know what I mean? So they'd study those things to try to figure out how people interpret them. We also talked about, the text talked about this probably more than I did, but how perception influences performance in school, right? So they had this lady that actually told kids that, or not, there's one lady that told kids that kids that had blue eyes were better than kids that didn't have blue eyes, and then they started treating them differently, and then a couple days later they said, no, the blue-eyed kids aren't as good, and how that influenced how students acted. And then they had another experiment where one lady was told, your students are all really good. And then she went in the class and she treated them another way. And then a different lady was told, oh, your students are all really bad, even though the students were normal, right? All just kind of average. And then they found that the students that were in the class where the teacher thought they were really good, the teacher had higher expectations and the kids did better. So it's trying to show that perception and expectations influence performance. As it relates to population growth in the world, which societies are growing the most? Poor countries, middle income, rich, what do you think? Yeah, poorer countries. There are some exceptions, but poorer countries. Which countries have the most people? Middle income. Middle. China and India are what? Middle income. That's like 35% of the world's population right there. Yeah. You remember China though? China has that one child policy, right? What was one latent function of the one child policy?
People killing certain like girls, did they do that? They killed girls because they wanted boys.
Yeah, abandonment, abuse of girls, way higher abortion rates. If a couple found out they were having a girl, abortion rates in that instance were way higher. So that kind of backfired for the Chinese a little bit because they had way more guys than they had girls, right? So they recently, it was like a month ago, they changed their policy to basically the 2-child policy now. Did you guys hear about that? To try to fix that a little bit.
Wasn't that because the age gap was getting so big?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you had, let's say, I don't even know the numbers, but let's say they had 30% more men than women in a certain group, as that filters through, you're not gonna have enough younger people in society, that kind of steamroll. Let's talk about social movements again. And if you guys have your book, I want you to open your book up to the page. It's got a box that talks about types of social movements, and then I'll say this page number for the people in the video too. It basically says the amount of change desired, and then who wants to get changed. It's talking about types of social movements. It'd be in chapter 16, roughly in the middle of chapter 16. So, if you have a social movement where you're trying to change everybody and you want a ton of change, okay, you're trying to change everybody, you want a ton of change. That's called revolutionary social movement. Do you see that? What page is that on, Michael?
444.
Okay, so page 444 has that graphic. So what is it called then, looking at that, where you want to change a small group of people or maybe one person a lot? What's that called? Reformative?
Wouldn't it be
Are you sure?
Never mind, that's everyone a little bit, never mind, yeah, redemptive.
Redemptive, so one person, you want to change a whole bunch, redemptive. What is it? Again, look at the graphic. If you want to change one person or small group a little bit.
Alternative.
Alternative, and then what if you want to change everybody a little bit? Reformative. So now, let's think of some examples here. Groups that seek to get people to recycle more. What would that be?
Reformative.
Because,
Recycling isn't a huge life change, but I mean, they want everyone to do it.
yeah, so if everybody recycled, let's say 5% more, it's not really that hard for us as individuals, but it would make a difference overall, right? If they said, we want everybody to like not drink ever again, like the prohibition movement. What's that? Revolutionary. So be able to apply that. There's a couple questions about that, where it basically says, this movement is trying to do this, what would it be? And you have to identify which one of those applies, okay? Another thing we talked about was affirmative action. What's affirmative action involve?
Isn't it like when you apply to colleges, there's like a point system to whether you get in, and based on your race or ethnicity, you get certain points?
It's not just college, and it's not just race and ethnicity.
Like, sex as well.
Okay. Yep, sex, gender applies also. So affirmative action basically is preferential treatment to people that have certain statuses. Often it's based on historical disadvantage or trying to encourage diversity. So in colleges, for example, one of my former students is the president of the Society of Women Engineers at NDSU. I remember some of my buddies, we were in the dorm and we were sitting around the table studying we were in, I think it was Western Civ class together, and it was like not just history majors, right? Because that's a general ed class. And one of my buddies is like, there was a girl in our engineering class. What? You know, and they were like surprised. So in part to try to encourage diversity and in part to try to correct past wrongs or something, affirmative action is argued for. Often it involves race, but it's not always race. It's some type of preferential treatment though. Not based on, like, if you're a better student than somebody else, that's not affirmative action, right? It's based on a status. So there's a bunch of court cases about that. Actually, in the paper today, I read a story, the Supreme Court is taking on an affirmative action case with the University of Texas. So it's another case. Yep. It's a different one than the one cited in the book. This was in the paper today.
Oh, well, I
Yeah.
just thought pretty poor girl because she didn't get into Texas State or something.
Yeah, usually what happens in those cases is, like, they've got 5 spots or 10 spots in a program, and if they use affirmative action, inevitably what's gonna happen is somebody's gonna get in that has worse qualifications than somebody that doesn't get in. And then that person sues, basically saying, I was a white guy, and my scores were better than this Hispanic lady, and I should have got in, it's not fair. So that's how affirmative action trials have gone, basically. So in the court, sometimes it's said it's okay and sometimes not. A lot of it depends on how it's set up. Okay, how about this? What if we decided that for every flight that we had in the United States, oh, well, actually, let's not even use the flight example. Let's use Donald Trump's example about saying we should ban Muslims from immigrating to the United States, right? You guys have heard about how Trump said that? What's that called? I mean, broadly it'd be discrimination, but what's it called more specifically? If you're worried about one specific group of people committing a crime or doing something bad. No. It's called profiling.
Oh, racial profile.
Yeah, racial profiling or, yep. And that's a debated issue, like, after September 11th, there were some people that were like, we should scan Muslim, Arab men to go on flights much more thoroughly than we should scan anybody else. They were arguing for racial profiling. And some people are like, that's not fair, it's based on a status, you shouldn't treat people differently. So that's still a debated point, right? Because on the one hand, you'd see like, some people would say, well, that's not fair, random guy, like, he's a student at NDSU, he's just trying to fly on a plane, why, just because he's Arabic, why should he have to get scanned in more detail? So the solution then is random, they'd say, okay, every fifth person we're gonna scan in more detail, and then some dude's 85-year-old grandma, although she might be the bad grandma from the example before, but let's just say like some dude's 85-year-old grandma gets pulled over and gets scanned like super extra, and then like a whole bunch of guys my age get through. Guys my age versus 85-year-old grandma, who's more likely to do something on a plane that's gonna be bad? Guys my age, regardless of racial or ethnic background, right? So some people argue, well, you gotta use common sense with it. Okay. I talked about that. What's the US like as it relates to politics and economics? Are we a socialist country? What's our country like?
We have free enterprise system.
Okay, we have a capitalist system with what else? Do we have welfare programs or not?
Yeah.
Yeah, quite a bit. Yeah. Got maybe about 5 more questions I'll talk about and then I'll open it up. In the United States, which ethnic group has the largest amount of single mothers? African Americans. Which one is the least? Asian Americans. Yep. What's the key difference between a church and a cult?
Isn't a cult like really extreme, whereas the church is just a social institution?
Is largely out of society.
How society views it and how connected it is to society, right? So if, let's say, Mercedes was talking to her friend and she's like, oh, this weekend I'm gonna go to our cult meeting. And your friend's like, what? Yeah, I'm gonna go to our cult meeting, you should come. Friend be like, no. But if she said, oh, we're gonna go to our church meeting, you should come. She's like, maybe, tell me about it, right? So that term cult has a connotation to it that's kind of negative, and it implies extreme beliefs and then also lack of connectedness to society, right? So let's stay on the religious theme then. What's the largest religious affiliation in the US?
Christianity?
More specific than Christianity?
Catholicism?
No. Protestantism is the most common in the United States. Yeah, of those branches, what's the most common in the United States? It's like almost all the South, from Texas through Florida up to North Carolina. Like draw a loop like that. Baptist, yeah, almost the whole South is that way. Yeah. Okay, as it relates to education, where does education do the best, like in the United States? What places tend to do the best in education? Is it like the central urban areas of cities? No. Suburbs, often in the Northeast, do the best. What areas do the worst? Inner city schools. What else? Southwest, border schools. So, anywhere else? Think in the state of North Dakota. No, beach. There's a lot of scholars coming out of beach, right? Yeah. Where else?
Reservations.
Reservations struggle quite a bit too. They talk a lot about the cost of healthcare going up, right? What else has gone up a lot in terms of cost in the last 10 years? Besides healthcare? Some of you have friends that are like a year or two older than you and they've experienced this a little bit.
Education.
College education costs have gone up. Actually, as a percentage, they went up faster than healthcare for a few years. I don't know if it was the same last year, but college education has gone up in price quite a bit. Okay, we talked about something called the demographic transition model. Remember that graphic that talked about birth rates and death rates? At the end, what is the trend as it relates to birth rates and death rates?
They eventually go down as you become more modern.
You have low of both, right? At the start, what do you have? High of both. Stage 2, high birth rates, death rates drop, right? Okay. Let's see. Last thing I'll talk about, sources of cultural change. Diffusion, invention, and discovery. So oil in Williston would be what? Discovery, right? It's been there. They didn't have to invent how to use oil and whatever, but when they first discovered it in 1980, and then now when they discovered ways of getting it again, that's a source of cultural change. How about a whole bunch of people move from one area to another and they bring their beliefs with them? Diffusion, yeah. Smartphones, invention, that changes culture. Good. Okay, any questions about anything at all? Thanks for coming. If you have any questions, let me know. Oh, the other thing I would say, I should say this to the people on here. I'll tweet some random stuff like I always do. Duck down in here. So check out Twitter, okay? They're getting the view of my stomach here.
You're like, wait.
Yeah.